I often see people using low carb fueling for two reasons. One is either to reduce weight, so it's using it as a calorie deficit strategy, and the other is to try and train their bodies to use more fat as fuel rather than carbohydrates as fuel. Generally, the conversation I have with athletes is getting an understanding of their training program, getting an understanding of their race program, and getting them also to understand that at higher intensities, the muscles will still rely on carbohydrates regardless. So if they're doing sort of a lot of zone 1, zone 2 training, then using low carb fueling strategies can be really useful because the body's just not requiring as much carbohydrates. So that's totally okay to be doing that. However, if they're doing any sort of sprint or interval training or hills, the body typically is going to want to, or typically will use carbohydrates as its main source of fuel, regardless if it's trained the body to use fat. So it's just a shift that happens in the body at those intensities. Your body will come back to use glycogen or glucose, I should say, as fuel. So if there's not enough of that stored in the body, then you're never going to perform at your best during those types of sessions. So it's important to get an understanding of which sessions you're doing it for and to get an understanding of why you're doing it as well.
Where would you say is that switch point between that endurance rides and high intensity rides? Is there like a special, like if you're at 70% of your functional threshold power and below, that you don't need to fuel as much?
Look, I would say it's very subjective as well because every athlete is going to be slightly different. So I'm hesitant to sort of provide numbers there because it really depends on the goal that we're trying to achieve. And I think the other thing to take into consideration is that if you're fueling on a very low carb strategy, are you then replacing that energy required through fat, or are you just doing it on a low level carbohydrate intake and then not replacing it with any other food source? Because if that's the case, then typically, particularly if you've done a really long endurance session on, say, 20 or 30 grams of carbs per hour, and let's just say, for example, this athlete's typically fueling at 60 or to 90 grams per hour, generally what might happen is post training, they're going to become hungrier later in the day, potentially later in the evening, and so they're generally going to have to play catch up at some point over the day. And what I find with this is it's not necessarily supporting the recovery of that session very well, but also we're getting an extra calories away from a training session as well. So I generally advise most of my clients and athletes to fuel appropriately around the training sessions. That may still be at a lower carbohydrate intake for a zone 1, zone 2, zone 3 sort of session. That's fine, and that would be a good strategy because you're obviously just not using as much carbohydrates or energy as a higher intensity ride or some sort of threshold or hill session. So it's just not needed. But if we're doing it from a weight loss point of view, we've got to be careful that we're not significantly underfueling you because you're going to have a bit of a bounce back effect later in the day and probably consume those calories elsewhere, which may be in the form of really high sugar foods. And so we've just replaced the carbohydrates around training, which could have been used really effectively, now giving them at you at a time of day where you just don't need them.
You touched on that before, that 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrate, is that considered low carbs? Or where's the point where it's considered low carbs?
Low carb cycling, I'd say, would be sort of anywhere from 0 to 20 grams per hour, but it's very dependent on the person. For someone who's just entering cycling as a sport, 20 grams of carbs per hour could actually be considered a lot. So it's a subjective measure there. From a dietitian's point of view, I would say anything under sort of 30 grams or below per hour is a low carb strategy, low carb fueling strategy.
The theory being with cycling, when you're going a maximal, you're going to be burning through your glycogen. The idea of low carb training is to train your body to be able to not use those glycogen stores until you need them. So if you do this low carb training, does that make your body more efficient at using fats as a fuel?
To an extent. So it can be really useful to, for endurance type training and, zone 2 base level training, you can train your body to use fat as fuel. However, as I said earlier, if you're hitting those higher intensities, the body will more effectively use glycogen as fuel to hit those intensities. And so this is where ketones come into play as well, and are quite popular in cycling at the moment, is they'll typically be used to store sort of use fat as fuel, use the ketones as fuel, and then use your carbohydrates later in the event. Timing of that has to be very particular. However, it's important to note that if you're only using fat as fuel, then if there was a sprint finish, for an example, you're never going to be able to do that as effectively if there's no glycogen in the body. You just cannot hit those intensities without it. So there's positives to it, but there's also negatives to it from a race perspective as well. And so dependent on which training session that you're doing, I would say anything that's high intensity or included any intervals or hill session, would still recommend that using carbohydrates as fuel is going to be far more effective from a performance perspective.
With low carb cycling, just in the training aspect, if you do that too much, will that have a long-term effect of like your body and your muscle not being able to store as much glycogen?
Not necessarily, but it's important to understand that carbohydrates are a really important part of strength and lean muscle as well. So if an athlete's typically using low carb fueling strategies over all of their sessions, first and foremost, they're never going to be performing at the level that they're capable of, or the intensities that they're capable of, but also that's going to have a potential effect on their lean muscle growth, their recovery strategies as well. So recovery for me starts prior to the session as opposed to after the session. So if we're underfueling by low carb fueling strategies during a session, that's going to potentially have an effect on muscle loss or strength loss as well. So I understand that there's a need for it in certain sessions because you're just not requiring the carbohydrate intake. However, for those high intensity sessions, there's just no way to cheat the system. Your body needs those carbohydrates to hit those intensities.
So low carb training and cycling is more for like ultra endurance events, so people riding the Audax events.
Again, I would argue that carbohydrate fueling is going to be a more effective way, appropriate carbohydrate fueling is going to be an effective way of supporting the performance. It can be useful for like zone 2 sort of based endurance sessions, but everyone's quite different, so there's no answer that's going to be right or wrong there. Where I would say that it is important is to look at your week of training. I've spoken about this in a few videos previously, but looking at your sessions over the week and picking out your 3 or 4 main sort of quality sessions, and doing carb cycling in a different sense of, choosing those sessions that you will go high carb for, and then choosing sessions that you'll potentially do lower carbohydrate fueling for. And that can be from both a performance perspective, but also from a calorie deficit point of view. But I'm a big believer that you should still fuel sessions appropriately to get the most out of those sessions, and then back off carbohydrates away from a training session where your body is just not using them. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a trend to under-fuel training sessions, but unfortunately what generally happens is that people will typically look for carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates later in the day or potentially the day after when their just body isn't requiring them. So I usually try to educate athletes on the fact that if we can fuel their sessions properly, they can back off carbohydrates elsewhere where their body is just not requiring as much from an energy source.